Father, I do give you thanks for your love, oh God, and just that you are here. And Lord, I do ask you to just speak and to God. And I praise you in Jesus' name. Amen, amen. I want to talk about it. It's a little bit, it's in Dead Dogs, sort of. It's kind of in the background. But I want to talk a little bit about a spiritual worldview and triggers in a spiritual worldview and how all of that happens, and just hopefully let you guys give some feedback and just kind of walk through that. Um, most of our the cultural point of view is very much the old scientific behaviorism, whatever point of view. I believe that you are created with a spirit that is God breathed and pretty much fully functioning from conception, which means that you have a spiritual memory, if you want to tag it that, a spiritual memory that actually begins from before your intellectual memory began. And that spiritual memory doesn't necessarily translate to visions and dreams, and it's stuff that is cognitively available, but it still is impacting you. And again, I share this story about my mom, and age 40 I find out that I was an unwanted child, and etc. And so the impact all of that was having on me, and stuff that's going on in the womb, stuff that's going on in that first year of life, second year of life, third year of life, actually is very significant, because you have what I would call a spiritual recorder going on during that period of time. And you already are who you are, i.e., you're already starting to exhibit some of the passions. Now, scientists will tell you that your character is like 90% formed by the time you're one, when you don't even have language development yet. So where does that character come from? And I believe it comes, those core passions that you're still are there today, were already there in the womb before you had even developed speech, language, cognitive memory. So you got all this stuff going. Well, that same ability is in the background throughout your entire life. And most of the time, it remains at a subconscious level. So you have this entire pool of stuff going on at a subconscious level that is impacting every word you say, every thought you think, every emotion you have. So just kind of let that soak in. And then the word triggers then come along at a subconscious, typically, level. They're below the perception level in terms of your cognitive thinking, in terms of what you're actually thinking about. But triggers come along and poke those things, and then all of a sudden I've got these responses going on. And typically what you're doing is, well, where did that come from? When you begin to pay attention to spiritual stuff, usually the trigger has a spiritual component to it, and it's reaching inside of you, poking something that has a spiritual component to it. And the spirit realm, here's another thing that I believe is eternal, i.e., the best language to me is it operates outside of time. So potentially you could have something that came along and was able to poke something that happened within the first few days of your conception, and you've got all these responses going on, and you don't even have a clue why you're responding that way. So just kind of let that set up. And then if you really want to make the picture bigger, spirit actually transcends, it's outside of time. And I believe that there is a spiritual influence. Now, scientists are continually trying to find a genetic influence. There's a gene that causes your alcoholism. There's a gene that causes whatever. What I do believe happens, according to Scripture, there is an influence that passes from the first generation to the second, third, fourth generation, And especially when you get into the third and the fourth generation, it's not a direct behavioral influence, which means it's something that has to be happening outside of time. And the way I describe that is the cloud. If you have one generation that puts something up in the cloud, on the fourth generation, I'm sitting around and there's not a whole lot of influence on me. It's still just kind of back there in the cloud. It's just kind of hanging around. But you know how the cloud works. Once you access one file, what happens? It knows. And it's making suggestions. And it's actively seeking you out. I mean, the way the internet works is such an incredible picture of the way I believe your spirit man works. So as soon as, I'm 10 years old and I behave a certain behavior or I start interacting in a certain way, now no longer is it just me. It's like I'm going back and accessing grandpa. I'm going back and accessing great, 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 great grandpa or great, 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 great grandma or whatever. And because of the outside of time nature of that, that stuff can have some pretty powerful effects on it. So begin to think about this in the whole spirit realm, and it changes your thinking about so many things. And I think you'll find if you start understanding these dynamics, I think you'll understand, oh wow, that puts a name and a face to some of the stuff I've been struggling with. So hang on.
I think you're absolutely right about that because it's like when I first triggered my addiction side when I was like 15, the first time I smoked pot, and until now it's been like a 25-year hiatus of drug to the next drug to the next drug to the next drug. But the cool thing about it is that I didn't know any of my Benson side of the right, but now that I've got to know some of them, they were all the same way, and this other side of me that's coming out now is just wanting to help other people in addiction and all this stuff. And so, like you're talking about pulling from the cloud and all that,
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing that's up in the cloud. Because my great uncle Mo, a woman in CPF, she knew him. She says if you had anything to do with recovery in the '80s, like you knew Mo.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's cool. It's I mean, there's negatives up there, I think, but there's positives up there.
And I'm glad that you brought that because a lot of times when we describe what I just described, all you're thinking about is the negative. But no, you have, and I call it, you've got a righteous man up there, i.e., you're laying up godly stuff. You're laying up all, so you got a righteous heritage laid up there in the cloud. You got an unrighteous and ungodly heritage laid up, and you did it. Thank you. That was perfect. That was right on cue. So all of that stuff is up there. It's all up there to be accessed. Now, you have a whole lot to do with whether or not you are or are not accessing that. And that's where if you go back to you're an alcoholic and you're like, well, okay, I'm better now. Now I can take a drink. And that's where I'm kind of like, are you kidding me? Because one drink reaches back and it grabs that file and it shakes it and it wakes it up with a vengeance. And I don't care how good you're doing, you might want to get a brain and realize that you're playing with some fire there. You may be in a better place now, but don't fool yourself, and so you have all of that going on. Now, for you to wrap your brain around that I've got this whole subconscious world going on out there. At some point that can be a little bit intimidating because I'm look at that going, wow, I got this mess out there that I have no ability to wrap my arms around and know anything. What I want you to and this is what I practice, what I do in terms of working with people. A lot of times people are amazed, how did you know that? How did you see that? How did you respond to that? You can bring the surface level, you can bring that subconscious level to the surface just by learning to be attentive to the spirit and spiritual factors. And it's basically what you're doing when you're looking at someone and you're reading body language. You're just turning that up to a little bit higher notch, and you're kind of being aware of that, and you ask a few questions. And once you start recognizing spiritual factors, here's the thing that I will tell you that people get mad at me about. Sometimes it's like, no, you haven't heard my story yet. You don't know all the details. You don't know all the information. But really, once you understand what I just laid out in terms of, I'm going to call them spiritual forces, to some extent, the details actually don't matter. You can have 10,000 different stories, but the most significant factor in terms of you getting better is to be aware of, it's in the bitterness zone. Once we identify that it's in the bitterness zone, do I need to know that it was Uncle Max? Not really. Do I need to know that it happened at age 4 and at age 7? Might be helpful because of arrested development, okay, but might not be helpful. Once you start identifying the spiritual factors, this is where unforgiveness and etc. You probably don't need to go back and find every single file point access. What you need to do is figure out, okay, this is what's going on. This is what I feel when it's happening. This is how I respond to it when it's happening. And this is how I close those doors, so to speak, overcome those things, and get to a better place. And so this helps give you my theology of forgiveness, so to speak. You need to forgive as many times as you need to forgive in order to clean that up, in order to re-strengthen what's going on in here, to get spiritual change in what's going on in here, to where that thing can no longer overcome me. And if that means I have to pray through 452 things, well, then you better get started praying. If it means I need to pray through 2 things, and it's kind of like I just got it, and I kind of got it down inside of me, and the next time it shows up, I look at it and say, excuse me, I recognize you, get out of here. You know what I'm saying? You may be the person who has to pray through it twice or once. Or you may be the person who has to pray through it 5,722 times. Okay. What matters in the end is that you start learning what's happening, learning how to recognize spiritual stuff, and how to exercise spiritual things in a way to take authority over what's coming after you. And again, most of the time, the details don't matter. Now, sometimes a specific incident is large enough that if I go after that specific incident and I get it prayed through, it's like the log jam in a river. You take the right log out and the whole thing, boom, it's gone. So sometimes a specific incident is like huge in this restoration picture. But it really isn't the incident when it comes down to it. It's the spiritual transformation that ends up being the picture of what's going on.
I was talking about my youngest daughter, and both my daughters actually, they have a lot of the social justice piece very strongly from their paternal grandmother, great-grandmother, so my grandmother. And I've been thinking about that a lot. But now when you talk also, because my dad was not very close to his parents. My mother made sure that we knew our grandparents on that side. But she was not one who would ever stand on the front lines, ever. And the social justice in my heart is very muted because I think through my mom, that was not approved, So now it is really bubbling up in my daughters.
In the next generation.
Yeah, in the next generation. That's very interesting.
And what's interesting, if you don't mind, I'll kind of expose some things here. In her situation, she grew up with these 2 competing sets of values, and I'm going to call one and this is a bad description, but it gets my point across. I'm going to call one a strength value and one a weakness value. Now, what do I mean by that? The strength value was more in that social justice, fight the fight in. The weakness value was more in no, let's not make waves. Let's learn to get along with each other. Let's be merciful. Let's be loving, etc. So again, I don't like the terminology, but just to make my point. So you've got a strength value, a weakness value. So then when Charlotte was stalked, then she got to the point where she literally hated the weakness value and wanted the strength value to wake up and to become a raging monster in her so that she would be able to stand up to the stalking thing. And so here you have these two sets of values that had been fighting within her family that became an internal war within her and then started translating to specific, I'm going to call it hatreds within her and specific loves within her that even turned inward and started tearing her up. And so part of her recovery process has been starting to sort all of that out and understand that I need this, quote, weakness, i.e. love and compassion value, just as much as I need the strength value. You see, when we're healthy, it's stand up, sit down. There's a point where, oh, wow, it's time for the strength value right now. Oh, it's time for the strength value to sit down right now. Oh, it's time for the weakness, i.e. mercy, love, compassion value to stand up. It's time for that compassion value to sit down. There are a lot of times with the spiritual gifts and with the core values that it's not either or, it's, okay, which one is getting the turn? Or once in a while, you're able to bring the two of them together where I'm being extremely firm and I'm being extremely strong right now, but I'm doing it in just the most compassionate way I know how. And so the two of them they're very uncomfortable, but they're working really hard to partner up in that thing. And sometimes it's almost like to really be a strength person, you almost have to lose the other one. Or to really be a mercy person, you almost have to lose the other one. So there are times when it really is stand up, sit down. And there's times when it really is, no, let's figure out how to partner together in this thing.
So listening to Charlotte and you talking about the strength and the weakness, I'm sitting here thinking back about my parents,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have that choice. I think what my choices were, I look at how their parents treated them,
Mm-hmm.
and if anything ever happened to the kids, if whatever choices the kids made, my grandparents always blamed my mom and dad on both sides. And what I'm getting at is there was no strength. It was if you did something wrong or something wrong happened in the family, you didn't talk about it. If you were mad about it, you did it to you went somewhere else and was mad about it. You didn't talk about it. It was swept under. I mean, from little things to big things. Mm-hmm. Like when I tried to commit suicide at age 18, I found out like a year later that my mom's parents blamed my mom and dad for that. Mm-hmm. Told them that they were horrible parents. How could you be a good parent and your daughter try to do that? And did my mom confront my grandparents? No. She just listened to it. They swept it under and went on. And so I was taught that when something happened, whether your feelings were hurt or something big or little, you just dealt with it. You shut up and you dealt with it.
No, you didn't deal with it, but
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they said. You just deal with it on your own. You don't talk about it. So now I'm in this program where when things happen, or actually I want to backtrack a few years. So my mom's been gone 5 years. Mm-hmm. And when something happens, I'm the exact opposite now. If something happens, we need to deal with it right now because I'm not going to put it in here and stew over it like I've been told to do for years. But I don't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to do it healthily. You know, if something happens at the house, I'm like, we need to figure this crap out right now. Right? See, I caught myself.
We're working. We're getting better.
I'm
yes.
getting better. We have to figure this stuff out right now. No thinking about it. No talking about it. No, see that word process.
I want an answer, and I want it now.
Right, because see, my parents basically told me, you know, deal with it and process it, but they didn't tell me how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to process it. I don't know how to do that. I want to fix it right now.
And frankly, that's
Sorry, I'm
why
yelling.
that's why a lot of you are here. And again, I'm going to take this back to the church, if you will. A lot of times what happens at a church level, you know, let's take sexuality just because it's an easy one to pick on. Don't do it. Don't get anywhere close to it. There's no explanation, there's no reasoning, there's no etc. And so next thing you know, all you've got is this let's sweep it under the rug mentality. And there's a point at which that just doesn't work anymore. And so yeah, you end up with that. And if you haven't figured out how to process stuff in a healthy manner from previous generations, then when it hits in this generation, I'm a 2-year-old trying to deal with 10-year-old stuff. Well, good luck with that. It just isn't going to go well. So much of what we do here is just drill over and over again healthy response. And I'll take it back to me. When this program started, one of the first things that I had to learn was I call it healthy confrontation. In other words, if I suspect that you're using or whatever, it's like, okay, how do I even approach that? Well, I didn't have good pictures and good models from my background. I mean, it was a multi-year process for me to figure out how do I approach you in that kind of a situation and how do we work that out? And we're still developing that. We're still developing, okay, when do you confront? How do you confront? What language do you use? What techniques, what skills, etc. The more of those you develop and the more skilled you become, well, then it passes from me to house leaders and house leaders to their houses. And the more healthy you get, the better you develop all of that, the more effective the program is. So a lot of times at church, it's like, just believe, just apply this doctrine. And people then outside of the church who don't believe in the same way or didn't get results are angry because it's not effective. And that's where there's a science to everything that we're talking about, and there's a science of healthy behavior, healthy confrontation, etc. Now, I want to pick up on something else you said, which is blaming the generation. Okay, it's all your fault. It's all your fault. And of course, we don't talk about it, etc. Let's find, if we can, let's find the healthiest part of that. In other words, if you're in a blaming zone, what would be the God part? Now, it's obviously unhealthy, all right? But what my thesis is in all of this, your sickness is a God-created part of you gone into a bad place. So I've got parents who are hyperactive in blaming. All right? What's the healthy part of blaming? Now, blaming in and of itself isn't healthy. All right? I'm not saying that. But if you have that tendency, what are the positive tendencies inside of a blaming person that you're like, okay, I need this part of it that would be healthy, but then I need to clean up the unhealthy parts, which are this.
Is it trying to find the truth?
Finding the truth would be part of it.
Yeah.
Good. Taking responsibility for your own actions. That's a very good part of it. Okay? So we've got finding the truth, taking responsibility is the positive part. All right? Now, what's the negative part of that?
Not accepting your part
Okay.
of the situation. You're just blaming and blaming.
So The
But-
grandparents at that point, in essence, were taking no share in that. They were
Right.
pushing it all off on the kids.
Right.
So that's good. Projection, trying to force responsibility on someone else. So I'm pushing off. Okay. What else? What would be the really unhealthy parts of blaming? Self-blaming. Okay. Now, I'm going to take part of it back to what I was just talking about, i.e., I'm not willing to do the work that I need to do to see the deeper picture and start walking this thing through in its complexity. Blaming usually goes to simplicity and has a simple target that becomes the scapegoat. And so blaming becomes a kind of a scapegoating instead of stepping back and seeing this larger picture and starting to deal with the situation in more of its complexities.
That means they don't want to deal with it either.
No.
But they're telling you to deal with it, but they don't want to deal with it. And so it just keeps going and going and going. I did the same thing to my kids.
Let me take this to recovery. And people have given me a hard time on this one because I do this. But from the time that the program started, I at least feel like I share blame every time somebody uses, fails, whatever. Now, that can be very unhealthy because I only have as much authority as people choose to give me. So if I take full blame for that, that's very, very unhealthy. All right. And I was there, and there were times when that was very sick in me. But if I take no blame, what happens every time someone uses? Well, I guess they didn't hit bottom yet. Well, I guess they didn't want it. Well, you've heard all of them. All of the excuses where we start simplifying and project onto the other person a simple answer so that I no longer share in the blame. Now, if I really believe in the one another lifestyle and I really believe we share outcomes, I got to own, I may have only had a 1% factor in the thing, but I'm continually looking for my 1%, my 5%, my 10%. How can we grow the entire program? Every piece of the influence authority base. So you go back to the grandparents had a stake in your suicide attempt. They had a stake in that. Now, did they ever step back and take any level of ownership? And what did that look like? And it might have been extremely small. But instead of going into a simplistic mode of blaming, that's what I talk about here. We've got to start seeing the spiritual factors, and there's thousands of them. And the more of those we identify, and the more cleanly we identify, and the more of those we change, the better you get as time goes on. You got something there?
How does nature versus environment play into this? Because being adopted, I have no idea what any of my biological family is like.
Okay,
versus
go ahead.
My parents that I grew up with.
I'm going to go two directions here. I'm going to completely ignore what you just said for just a moment because I want you to understand this first piece, and then I'll come back directly to what you brought up. The first thing that I want you to understand, and I make this statement, everything's spiritual. The spirit realm manifests through the natural realm. All right, let me say that again. The spirit realm manifests through the natural realm. So there ends up being a cooperative relationship between the spiritual realm and the natural realm. So over a period of time, your body develops things called habits, and those habits turn into something called muscle memory. That's part of what makes it incredibly difficult to quit smoking. Are you ready? Just that hand, eye, all of that. Okay, so spirit realm manifests through the natural realm, and so the physical realm does get tied up in this whole thing. When I say everything's spiritual and spiritual law, I am not negating the natural realm in that, because there is an incredible spirituality to the natural realm and to the habits and to behavior. So when I talk about the power of the spiritual realm, the first thing I want you to understand is I am not eliminating the natural when we say that. So I want you to go there. Now, you brought up something extremely different because, and it ties back to what I just said. There is this thing called genetics. Well, the genetics, there is a specific code that is passed from one generation to the next. And so in that DNA code, there is a direct transmittal of physical stuff and physical code that ties into this whole process, and you can't take that out of it. And so you've got this whole genetic thing, and so you're a product of a genetics. But you also have, I don't believe that you just have a physical heritage. I believe that you've got a spiritual heritage. The sins are passed to the third and fourth generation. So you were adopted. You were taken out of a situation. You still carry your genetics with you, but you also carry a spiritual heritage with you from the second, third, and fourth generation that at this point you have almost no information about. That stuff is still there. It travels outside of time, outside of space. Now, you are a human being that operates inside of time and space. So once you were adopted, you came to a whole new land. You spoke a whole new language. Now, what's the spiritual dynamics of a whole new land and a whole new language? Somewhere between rejection, abandonment, etc., you got a whole layer of spiritual stuff that's happening just by being pulled out of this land over into this land. You have a set of values over in this culture that you are becoming comfortable with and were already written on your recorder, and you get yanked and landed in a place that's just like totally different to that. Think about the shock that was there to your system. I mean, you've got this traumatic shock back in there in your system. So I've got spiritual stuff coming down. I've got genetic stuff coming down. Then you were relatively young. So guess what? Behavioral influence is huge. So your whole log of memories and experiences from that point on are largely tied to something that was completely different than this thing over here. So now I have a whole upbringing, a whole behavioral influence over here that doesn't necessarily match up with this thing over here. Chances are you feel neurotic a lot of the time, where you're just kind of like something's floating around over here and I'm just kind of in la la land, but yet I've got all of this at the conscious realm that I'm thinking about, and et cetera. And this conscious realm of my memory years doesn't really fit up with this other stuff that there's just something inside of me that I just don't even know what to do with. So don't know if that answers your question, but again, all of those pieces, as human beings, you're unbelievably complex. So I'm giving you descriptions that are like, wow. And yet, when I sit down with you as a human being, I know that you are so complex and so beyond what my brain can interpret. I better be hearing from God if I'm going to try to help you. Because everything that I have said makes you a complexity that's beyond what my brain could ever wrap around. So I better be led by someone, i.e. God, when I'm working with you, or I'm grasping at straws trying to measure you against somebody else, and that just ain't fair and it ain't right.
Tagging on that, but also what we talked about before, being here and in the one another lifestyle, we talk about outcomes. I feel like through all the years I've gone to counseling or anything, it's always been just here and now. Who do you blame? We need to deal with that. We need to deal with you.
It's your fault.
Yeah, well, and the relationship, if you blame someone else, how
Right.
do you mend this relationship? But the spiritual layer and the outcomes of, what was before and what will come after is never talked about.
Mm-hmm. And again, the picture is so much bigger. And a lot of the time, there's stuff floating around in there that was big. Now, if you have a single incident in your womb, it's probably not going to overpower you. But if the entire experience in your womb was really dominant in one direction, that ends up being a major impact on you. And so what happens here is what I call the compounding of the factors. When it's mom, when it's grandma, and now it's my life experience, and now it's societal experience. And the more compounding you have, the more multiplying you have of factors, the greater the factor it becomes in you. Now, here's what happens. How many of you feel like you're like fish out of water, outcasts, what's wrong with me type of a sense about yourself? Okay? Now, here's the deal. There's nothing wrong with you. You function exactly the way you were created to function. As we talked about yesterday, you had some bad stuff dumped into you. I mean, if you listen to all of the factors, now, it may not just be bad stuff. It might be your own bad choices. There have been some bad stuff dumped into you in combination with some bad choices. And you put the two of those together, the only way you're going to overcome it is the authority of God exercised in a way to defeat the bad stuff inside. Now, we don't normally go to this level of detail or complexity or etc. So then you, after all of that, which is overwhelming, etc., then it comes down to, okay, now we need to identify, all right, what's the core thing? And that's not as tough as you think, because as spiritual human beings, after a little while, you can start to identify, here's the core value. So I know it's somewhere in that core value area, and here's the unhealthy spinoff. So then we can take it all the way down to the third law of heart change, which is obey God in the one thing. And so all of that complexity then gets boiled down to, you know what, for you to get better, and it's not going to answer everything, but it's going to be a whole lot of the process. I want you to start paying attention to this one thing on a consistent basis over a period of time. Take your situation and start digesting that a little bit. What is the deepest, most consistent value literally over generations? See, you don't just have a value. There tends to be an overriding value in your generations. I don't know if anybody heard it, but what's the deepest value that he expressed? You probably can't hear it from what he just said, so I won't play with you, okay? The deepest value in his family is a deep loyalty value. Huge loyalty value. Out of that is honor. Out of that is respect, the need to be respected, the need to be honored. So that loyalty honor value is huge. Well, what happens when loyalty honor value is huge? If anybody disrespects you or dishonors you, the woundedness in that area is huge. And when the woundedness in that area happens, guess what? Instead of having a tight-knit gang of a family that's very tight-knit, when that loyalty value is high, the woundedness is high. And so at some point, in order for me to go on, I cut you off. So what's ironic, the family's greatest strength, which is loyalty, has ended up being the family's greatest weakness, where, well, if that's the way you're going to treat me, in order for me to deal with my pain, I just cut you off, and family member after family member ends up being cut out of the family and sent off as a black sheep, and yet they've still got this core value, and they've got this incredibly deep desire to be respected and a deep desire to belong, and so they continue to try to knock on doors to find a place where they can belong, but they never quite feel like they have belonged because what? They haven't resolved this deep woundedness that is there literally for generations. And I've just described family member after family member after family member on this huge wide circle that are just there's just a desperate search to belong and to feel like they're a part of something in a family sense, and then the respect and the honor piece that goes along with that.
So how do you marry into one of those families?
Oh, my advice is don't. Again, it's a step-by-step process to redeem that, to restore that. That family value, that honor is a good value. It's a good value. But in every instance, your greatest weakness will come out of your greatest strength. What I just described there, you basically take what was meant to be their shining light, their gift to offer to the world. It's in a shambles, and it's destructive, and etc. So, I mean, the only answer that I can give you is you better hopefully be able to bring enough influence to start redeeming and restoring that quality within the family. Otherwise, you become a victim, if you want to use that word. You chose to marry in or whatever, but you become a victim of all of those dynamics that are operating, and all things work by spiritual authority. So here I am. I'm a BB against whatever semi-automatic weapon, and I'm wondering why it's not working. And a lot of times we don't see that bigger picture. We don't see the dynamics, and then, well, I guess God just doesn't answer prayer. How about if you understand the dynamics and we start applying the weapons of the warfare to the degree and at the level that it would actually take to overcome? But what we do, we just go back and pray the same 5 prayers and read the same 10 scriptures and attend church and wonder why it's not getting better. All things work by spiritual authority. If you're getting better, it's because you're walking in godly authority. If you're not getting better, it's because you're not walking in godly authority. It's really that simple. Or the godly authority isn't enough yet, so we better find a way to compound, multiply the godly authority to where we can actually win. So what's the way out for you? I wish it was that simple. I wish I could say, just do this one thing, which actually is where I need to be able to go, because is there going to be one simple thing that's going to win the entire thing? And the answer is no. But for you, let's at least start with getting it boiled down to the simplest, most consistent thing. And if I were to say, let's take blaming, now I want the parallel obedience response that's going to tear down the blaming. You can really answer that with one word. And what's that one word? Acceptance is close. I'm gonna start with the word owning. So instead of blaming, instead of looking at this generation or that generation or this thing or this source or that source, I start with, and I'll take it back to where I am when I work with the program. I don't start with somebody walked away and used. What is their problem? I start here. And then I go to the leadership. And I go to what's being presented. Then I take a look at that person. It's an owning process, step by step, all the way through. And instead of blaming, if I was to use one word to overcome that, it is owning and starting to pray through each of the different factors. If I do owning entirely here, now I've gone simplistic. If I do owning entirely here, there may be so many spiritual factors out there that I can own everything about my own self and end up being run over and defeated. Exactly. That's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. And her statement was she owns everybody's stuff, okay, which makes her feel even worse. That's where you have to go to chapter 2 in Dead Dogs, and what I'm talking about here. It's called right judgment. No, you don't own everybody's stuff. You're not responsible for everybody's stuff. You're one cog in a generational mess. So the first thing that you do in terms of right judgment, it is okay to understand I'm this way because of. And you're able to look back and go, wow, look at what came down on me. Look at what came down on me. Look at what came down on me. That's right judgment. Now, if I keep looking at that, what's going to happen? I never look at myself. I never take my one-step obedience. I never get better. But at some point, it's helpful. Otherwise, you go into a self-hatred, which is why you're not feeling good right now. You go into a self-hatred where it's all my fault. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is, as soon as I started talking the way I did, many of you are like, wow, I'm a screwed up mess. No, you're not. You're a product of your generations. Did your decisions figure into that? Yeah, they did. So you've got some ownership to do. But the first thing that I'll tell you, don't take this too far or it becomes a mess. But the first thing I'll tell you is it's not your fault. You're a product of the outcomes of the generations. Now, the second thing I'll tell you is take ownership of your own stuff. But, if you look at a 2-year-old kid that's behaving in a certain way, how many are you going to blame the 2-year-old? Now, does the 2-year-old have some? I'll tell you what. We have a kid who wasn't even 6 months old, grandson, who, the parents are just kind of like in shock trying to figure out if this really happened. Who they had told him not to give food to the dog. He promptly looked at them, smiled, took something off of his tray, and went over and let go of it and dropped it to the dog. 6 months old. That child had something going on there that he still owned even at that age, okay? I'm just telling you, there's more function than we give credit, okay? But the majority of what's going on in that 6-month child is not the child. It's mom, it's dad, it's grandpa, it's grandma, it's whatever, all right? So the first part of this, a lot of why you're feeling bad is the self-blame / self-hatred. So frankly, the first part of this is being able to look at yourself in the mirror and go, 95% of this is not my fault. This is what landed on me. Now, if you stay there, you're powerless to fix it. So you've got to make that judgment, get that judgment handed off to God, and then come back to the 5%. Because if I major on the 95%, I can't do anything and I remain a victim for the rest of my future. So I honestly, when I wake up, I go, I am this way because of Aunt Sally and Uncle whoever and et cetera. This happened to me and this happened to me, and I have a reason why I'm where I am. All right, are you done with that? Are we good? All right, there it is, God. Okay, now then I come back in real time and I begin to say, okay, what can I do about what's my one thing? Obedience. So I put my focus where it needs to be so that I can get better. But if I lose the 95% perspective up here, it's all my fault. And when I go into it's all my fault, I go into self-hatred. And when I go into self-hatred, that self-hatred will absolutely dominate you and control you to the point to where you can't get better. So I need to do that honest evaluation of this, and this landed on me. God, no wonder. But then you've got to get it handed off to God in a way that I can come back and focus on the 5% that's me and start doing the one thing, obedience, because focusing on that 95% will get you what? Nowhere. But owning the 95% will trap you in a bondage to where you can't get better, and it'll make you feel like you are this perverted, messed up, hopeless thing when you are not. You're absolutely a product of your environment, spiritual factors in combination with your choices. You know, don't you feel better to be able to say, it's not all my fault?
So I've got the question about the spiritual heritage. I was never grown up in the church except for just like a little bit, and I've told you before I've really had experience with the demonic, and I look at both my real dad, my stepdad, and my mom. I got a lot of demonic issues going on there, but their families, and my mom was married to a Pentecostal before I was born. Could that be the reason I'm so spiritually sensitive on both realms?
Absolutely. You know, you have your family heritage exhibits that heritage. And the answer is absolutely yes. You have spiritual sensitivity in both a positive way and a negative way. You have spiritual sensitivity being handed down in your heritage. And I'm going to say it was farther back. And so guess what? Spiritually sensitives do what? They swing one way or the other. Spiritual sensitivity is spiritual sensitivity. And it's potentially going to connect with the demonic. It's potentially going to connect with God. But it's not likely to sit there, and the only alternative to that is to go into some form of shutdown. So I'm either a spiritually sensitive or I'm in shutdown. And chances are you've had some of both in your heritage, where I'm a spiritually sensitive, and if you don't know how to use it and you don't know how to walk in it, then that spiritual sensitivity sends you into orbit. So then once I've been in orbit for a while, then the only way that I can handle life is just to, all right, I'm just going to stop feeling, I'm going to stop everything, and I'm just going to go into shutdown. And when you do that, you become almost non-human. So that's just the other end of the spectrum. So learning how, all of these factors are at work in you. They are invisible, they are unseen. So I've got to start sorting that out and then walking it out. Again, the most powerful thing you can do is the one thing, obedience. In the end, your body wins, even though I'm talking about all the spirituality. Most of the time, if you simply start walking it out in a one step at a time, doing the right thing basis, you'll find that basic behavior starts directing and guiding the spiritual factors in a way that you get better. Now, sometimes it's like, no, we got to pray over this thing, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. There's specifics there that we have to do. And again, this process is so highly complex. There's no way I can walk up to you. I can walk up to you and with spiritual sensitivity identify stuff just pretty fast. But there's no way I can walk up to you and know the solutions near as fast because you're such a complex being. It's like, okay, this is kind of what I have a pretty good idea what I'm dealing with right away, but I don't know how you're going to respond as a human being. I don't know what all of the intricacies of the dynamics are, so then it's a matter of feeling your way through and looking for the steps that will open up the door to spiritual authority in order to help you get to a point of victory. Now, this has been a crazy overview of stuff, Any questions? Are we good? I think I think it's time for us to take a break. So let me just say a quick word of prayer, and then we will. God, I do pray that you'll take this, and it's incredibly complex and overwhelming and a lot of other stuff. But yet, God, I do pray that you'll take it and there'll be kind of a foundation for understanding to where we can take this and start applying it in ways that we can hear your voice, we can connect with you, we can be strengthened, and we can walk it through to get better. And I give you thanks. And God, just work your redeeming power in our lives and through our lives. And I praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.